The letter said his name was Thaddeus Crane, and Margaret Calloway had read it so many times on the train that she could recite the words it didn't actually contain. The words about kindness, about patience, about a man who wanted a wife, and not just a pair of hands for his kitchen. She had built him out of what the letter left unsaid, the way a person builds a house out of the spaces between the boards, and by the time the train pulled into Coldwater Bend, Wyoming, she believed in that house enough to step off the platform without trembling. The man waiting for her at the station was not Thaddeus Crane. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, "I'm afraid I have bad news." She set her trunk down very carefully, the way she did everything when she was trying not to feel something too quickly. "Where is he?" "Buried him Tuesday last. Fever took him fast. 3 days, maybe 4. I'm sorry to be the one telling you on the platform like this, but there wasn't a way to reach you. You'd already left Ohio by the time the doctor knew it was bad." Margaret was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 2 of those years writing letters to a stranger because the alternative, staying in her sister's crowded house in Dayton, sleeping on a cot in the sewing room, being grateful, had become a kind of slow suffocation she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. She had not loved Thaddeus Crane. She had loved the idea that somewhere west of everything she knew, there was a house with her name on the deed, and a kitchen that was hers to ruin or perfect as she saw fit, and no one standing in the doorway, reminding her how much she owed for the privilege of being there. Now there was no house, no deed, no kitchen. "I have $8, she said, mostly to herself, doing the arithmetic of a woman whose whole plan had just become smoke. The man with the hat, Otis Renner, he told her, Crane's business partner in the freight company, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "There's a hotel. I can stand you a night or 2 while you work out your situation." "My situation," Margaret repeated. The phrase sat strangely in her mouth, too small for what had just happened to her life. She did not cry on the platform. She had promised herself somewhere around the Nebraska line that whatever happened in Wyoming, she would not be the kind of woman who cried in public over a man she'd never met, and she intended to keep at least that promise, even if every other plan she'd made had collapsed in the time it took a man to take off his hat. It was the town's marshal who found her an hour later, still sitting on the bench outside the station with her trunk, because the hotel Otis Renner had mentioned turned out to be full of cattle buyers in town for the auction, and Renner himself had developed a sudden and pressing need to be elsewhere. "You're the one who came for Crane," the marshal said. It wasn't a question. Coldwater Bend was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the people carrying it. "I was," Margaret said. "I'm not sure what I am now." He was tall in the unhurried way of men who had stopped needing to prove anything with their height a long time ago, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had weathered a few winters without complaint. He introduced himself as Silas Holt, and he did not offer her pity, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. "There's a room at Widow Abernathy's boarding house," he said. "She takes in respectable women between situations. I'll walk you over. I don't have much to pay with. She'll work something out. She generally does." He picked up her trunk before she could protest, settling it against his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, though Margaret knew for a fact it held every book she owned, and most of her mother's china, wrapped in petticoats for the journey. "Crane have any family hereabouts? Anyone to see to his affairs?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I knew him through letters, 2 years of them. I thought I knew him better than I apparently did, since I had no idea he had a freight partner, or a town, or—" She stopped herself before she said a life, because that felt like an unkind thing to say about a dead man, even one who had been, in the end, mostly a stranger. Silas glanced sideways at her as they walked. "You're taking this steadier than most would." "I had 4 days on a train to get steady. I used them." That earned her something that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood as one. Widow Abernathy turned out to be a broad, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who took one look at Margaret's face and decided apparently that feeding her was more urgent than discussing payment. By the time Margaret had eaten her first real meal in 4 days, stew, biscuits, a slice of dried apple pie that she would later describe, in the privacy of her own head, as the finest thing she had tasted in a year, she had also learned that Thaddeus Crane's freight business, along with 40 acres bordering Coldwater Creek, had apparently gone unclaimed since his death, because as far as anyone in town knew, he had no living relatives. You were set to marry him, Mrs. Abernathy said, refilling Margaret's coffee without being asked. Did you sign anything before you left Ohio? Any contract? Any paper? A marriage agreement. He sent it with the second letter. I signed it and mailed it back. The widow exchanged a look with Silas Holt that Margaret couldn't quite read, though she understood somewhere underneath her exhaustion that it mattered. You ought to speak to a lawyer, Silas said. Tomorrow, not tonight. Tonight you ought to sleep. I don't have money for a lawyer. Hollis Greer does work on credit for people he believes are owed something, Mrs. Abernathy said. And honey, if half of what I just heard is true, you may be owed quite a bit. Margaret slept that night in a narrow bed under a quilt that smelled like cedar and someone else's grandmother, and she did not dream about Thaddeus Crane at all. She dreamed instead about the Marshal's steady hands lifting her trunk like it was nothing, and woke up irritated with herself for it. Hollis Greer's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and he read the marriage agreement twice before he looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't place. This isn't a standard contract, he said. Crane had this drawn up specific. There's a clause here. In the event of his death prior to the marriage being formalized, any property held jointly under the agreement passes to the named party. That's you, Miss Calloway. He named you as the named party. I never married him, Margaret said. We never even met. Doesn't matter for the language here. You signed an agreement to enter into a contract of marriage, and he attached property to that agreement before the fact, which is unusual, but it's not improper. He wanted you protected if something happened to him before the wedding. 40 acres along the creek, plus his half share in the Coldwater Freight Company. Renner owns the other half. Margaret sat very still, turning the words over until they made sense. He left it to me. A woman he never met. Some men get practical when they're dying, Hollis said. Or maybe he just liked the idea of you enough to want you taken care of, even if he never got the chance to know you properly. He set the papers down. I'd advise you to be careful who you tell about this, and how fast. Otis Renner's going to find out eventually, and freight land along that creek isn't worth what it used to be. It's worth a great deal more, on account of the railroad spur they're surveying for next spring. Whoever holds that water access stands to make a fortune leasing it to the rail company. Renner doesn't know that yet? Renner knows it very well. I'd guess that's exactly why he didn't mention any of this to you on the platform yesterday, and why he was in such an almighty hurry to disappear once the Marshal showed up. Margaret thought about Otis Renner's uncomfortable face at the station, the way he'd offered her a hotel that he must have known was full, the way he'd vanished. She had spent 4 days on a train building a man named Thaddeus Crane out of careful sentences and good intentions. And in the space of one morning, she had learned he was kinder and more complicated than she'd ever imagined, and that his business partner was likely a thief. What do I do? She asked. First thing, don't sign anything Renner puts in front of you, no matter how reasonable it sounds, until I've read it myself. Second thing, Hollis allowed himself the smallest, driest smile. Go see your land. The 40 acres sat along a wide bend in Coldwater Creek, with a half-built cabin, a falling-down barn, and grass that grew up past Margaret's knees in a way that suggested no one had grazed it properly in a long while. She stood at the edge of it, with Silas Holt beside her. He'd offered to escort her out, citing the general lawlessness of a woman traveling alone with newly known assets, though Margaret privately suspected the lawlessness of Coldwater Bend was milder than he made it sound. It's not much, she said. It's water rights on a creek that doesn't run dry in August, Silas said. Out here, that's not much the way a vein of gold isn't much. Margaret walked the fence line slowly, trailing her hand along the rail in a way that felt absurdly like greeting something. He built half a cabin for a woman he'd never met. Men do strange things when they're lonely and trying not to be. Silas said it plainly, without weight, but Margaret glanced at him anyway. Caught by something in the way he'd said it, like a man who knew the feeling personally and didn't intend to discuss it further. Is that why you became Marshal here? Loneliness? That's a personal question for a woman I met yesterday. You're the one who walked me out here unasked. He considered that, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. I came west after the war looking for a place that didn't ask me to be anything in particular. Coldwater needed a Marshal worse than it needed anything else, and I was tired enough of moving to let myself be needed somewhere. He looked out at the creek, not at her. Staying turned out to suit me better than I expected. Do you regret it? Not for one day. They stood at the fence a while longer, not speaking, and Margaret found she didn't mind the quiet the way she'd minded most silences in her life. The careful, waiting silences of her sister's house, where quiet always meant someone was deciding whether you'd earned your place at the table that month. This silence asked nothing of her. "I'll need to hire someone to finish the cabin," she said eventually, mostly to break it before it could mean too much. "I know a man. Honest, reasonable rates. I'll send him round. You seem to know a great many useful men. Marshal Holt, small town. You learn who's worth knowing fast, or you learn it's slow and expensive." For the first time since the station, he looked at her directly, the corner of his mouth tilting in something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite something else. "I'd rather you learned it fast." Otis Renner came to call 3 days later, smiling in a way that made the hair on Margaret's arms stand up before he'd said a single word. "Miss Calloway, I wanted to apologize properly for how things went at the station. Poor judgment on my part, leaving you standing there like that." He had brought a folder of papers, which he set on Widow Abernathy's parlor table with the particular care of a man laying a trap he believed was well disguised. "I thought, given the circumstances, you might want to simplify your situation. Selling your interest in the freight company and the land back to me would spare you the burden of managing property you didn't ask for, in a town you don't know, among people you've only just met." "That's very thoughtful of you," Margaret said. "I'd offer a fair price. More than fair, considering the land's rough condition." How fair? He named a figure that made Margaret's pulse pick up. Not because it was generous, but because she had spent the morning with Hollis Greer, learning exactly what the railroad survey meant for that creek. And Renner's offer was perhaps a tenth of what the water rights alone would fetch once the spur line went through. "I'll consider it," Margaret said, which was a lie, but a useful one. "I'd like a few days to think it over, and to have my lawyer review the paperwork naturally." Something flickered behind Renner's smile, irritation quickly smoothed over. "Of course, though I'd advise against waiting too long. Land like that can attract trouble for a woman alone. Squatters. Disputes. It would ease my mind to know you weren't carrying that burden." "How considerate of you to worry about my burdens, Mr. Renner." He left without his folder of papers, which Margaret had declined to keep, and she stood at the window watching him go with a tightness in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as anger, clean and useful, nothing at all like the fear she'd carried off the train 4 days earlier. She told Silas Holt about the visit that evening, when he came by the boarding house on his rounds, ostensibly to check that everything was secure, though Margaret had begun to notice his rounds brought him past Mrs. Abernathy's with suspicious regularity. "He knows about the railroad survey," Silas said when she'd finished. "Has known for months, I'd wager. He's been trying to buy up creek frontage quiet-like since spring, and Crane wouldn't sell his half no matter what was offered. That's likely why he had that contract drawn up the way he did. Crane didn't trust Renner enough to leave the land in his hands if something happened. Crane was protecting it from his own partner. Looks that way." Margaret sat with that for a moment, the strange tenderness of being protected, sight unseen, by a man who'd never gotten the chance to meet her, who had perhaps suspected he was dying and used his last clear-headed weeks to build a wall around a stranger he'd only known through letters. It was not the safety she had come west looking for. It was something stranger and more durable. "I'm not selling," she said. "Didn't think you would." Silas said it the same way he'd said it at the fence line, like a fact he'd already settled in his own mind, waiting only for her to catch up to it. "Renner won't take that well. I'd feel easier if you let me walk you to the freight office and back while you're settling the business end of things. Just until he understands you're not going to be managed. Is that a professional concern, Marshal, or a personal one?" "Can't it be both?" She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one, and he didn't press her for it, and somehow that felt like its own kind of conversation. The weeks that followed had a shape to them that Margaret hadn't expected grief and uncertainty to have. Not smooth, exactly, but purposeful. Mornings she spent at the half-built cabin, learning the difference between a roof that would hold through a Wyoming winter and one that wouldn't, working alongside Tom Ferris, the carpenter Silas had sent, who turned out to be missing 2 fingers on his left hand and didn't seem to notice the absence anymore. Afternoons she spent at the freight office with Hollis Greer's clerk, learning the books Thaddeus Crane had kept. Careful, orderly columns that told her more about the man's mind than any letter had, and turning away, twice, men who arrived on Renner's behalf with new and increasingly creative offers to buy her out. In the evenings, more often than either of them probably should have allowed, Silas Holt walked her back to the boarding house. "You don't have to do this every night," she told him once, 3 weeks in, when the late September air had turned sharp enough to bite at her wrists. "I know, that's not an answer. It's the only one I've got that's true." He glanced at her, and there was something unguarded in it that made her chest go tight in a way she'd stopped trying to name. "I like the walking. I like the company. If you'd rather I stopped, I will." "I didn't say that, no," he agreed. "You didn't." They had reached by then a kind of conversation that didn't require either of them to say the harder things directly. A language built out of small honesties, offered sideways, neither of them quite brave enough yet to set the whole truth on the table between them. Margaret found she didn't mind the slowness of it. She had spent 2 years writing careful letters to a man who turned out to be a stranger built entirely of guesswork. She was in no hurry to repeat the mistake of believing too quickly in a shape she'd invented herself. Whatever this was with Silas Holt, she wanted to know it was real before she let herself want it. It was Bertie, the widow Abernathy's 11-year-old granddaughter who'd come to live with her that spring after her mother passed, who finally said the thing neither of the adults would. "You're sweet on the Marshal," Bertie informed Margaret one evening, with the devastating directness only children seem to manage, while Margaret braided the girl's hair by lamplight. "Everybody says so, Mrs. Pruitt at the dry goods says it's the talk of the whole street, the way he walks you home every single night, like the town's gone wild with outlaws all of a sudden. Is that so? He never used to walk anybody home before you came. He used to just sit on the jailhouse steps and clean his boots." Margaret laughed despite herself. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind she hadn't let herself have much of since Ohio. "Is that meant to be evidence?" "It's good evidence," Bertie said, with the confidence of a girl who had clearly been turning the question over for some time. "Grandmother thinks so too. She's already decided where you'll sit at the wedding." "There's no wedding, Bertie." "Not yet," Bertie said in a tone that suggested the matter was, as far as she was concerned, already settled and merely awaiting the slower comprehension of grown people. The trouble with Otis Renner came to a head in October, on a morning cold enough that Margaret's breath hung visible in the freight office when she arrived to find the lock already broken and her ledgers gone. She found Silas at the jailhouse within the hour, and within 2 more he had Renner himself sitting in a chair across from his desk, sweating despite the chill, while a deputy searched the back room of the freight office and turned up the missing ledgers stuffed behind a feed sack, along with a second set of books. In Renner's own hand, recording payments from a railroad surveyor that had never once appeared in the company's official accounts. "You've been selling information about the spur line route," Silas said, reading through the second ledger with the flat, careful attention of a man who intended every word of it to be used in court, "and skimming freight contracts besides. How long?" "This is a misunderstanding," Renner said. "Those books are in your hand, Otis. I've seen your hand on 100 bills of lading. Don't waste both our mornings." It came out, in pieces, over the following days, that Renner had been quietly defrauding the freight company for the better part of 2 years, that Crane had begun to suspect it not long before his death, and had started keeping his own private records, the very ones that had now turned up to damn his partner. That Renner's urgency about Margaret's land hadn't only been about the railroad money. It had been about making sure she sold quickly, before anyone thought to look too closely at the books he'd have to hand over to a new, careful owner. "He never planned on me actually inheriting anything that mattered," Margaret said to Silas, the night it was all finally untangled, sitting on the boarding house porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. "He thought I'd be frightened and far from home and grateful for any offer at all. Most men in his position would have been right about that." "I was frightened," Margaret admitted. "I still am, some days. I just decided being frightened wasn't a good enough reason to hand my life to the first man who asked for it. I already tried that once with a stranger's letters. I wasn't going to do it twice in 1 year." Silas was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "Crane wasn't wrong about you then. Whatever he saw in those letters." "What do you mean?" "He told me once, before he passed, when the fever was still mild enough that he could talk sense, that he'd never met a woman who wrote like she meant every word and never wasted one. Said it made him nervous, how much he was starting to want her to actually exist the way she sounded on paper. He glanced at Margaret, something raw and unguarded moving across his face before he could stop it. I told him I hoped she did. I didn't think I'd be the one finding out. Margaret sat very still, turning that over, the strange, generous gift of it, a dead man's hope passed sideways into the hands of a living one. Is that an answer to a question I haven't asked yet, Marshal Holt? Might be. He set his cup down. Might be I'm asking you something instead. Whether there's room, in whatever life you're building out there on Crane's old land, for a man who spent the last 6 weeks finding any excuse he could to walk you home. There might be, Margaret said, and felt something in her chest unknot that had been wound tight since the moment a stranger took off his hat on a train platform and told her the man she'd come to marry was dead. There might be room for exactly that. By the following spring, the cabin on Coldwater Creek had 4 finished rooms, a porch facing east to catch the morning light, and a kitchen Margaret had built almost entirely to her own specifications, down to the window over the wash basin that looked out on the water. The railroad spur came through in May, just as Hollis Greer had predicted, and the lease Margaret negotiated for the creek frontage. With Hollis's careful guidance and her own hard-won understanding of the freight ledgers, was generous enough that she never again had to wonder how she'd pay for anything she needed. She married Silas Holt in June, in a ceremony small enough to fit on the cabin's new porch, with Widow Abernathy crying without apology and Bertie serving as the most self-important flower girl Coldwater Bend had ever produced. Margaret wore her mother's china, not on her person, but laid out on a borrowed table for the gathering afterward, every plate intact despite the long journey west, and she thought, setting out the last of them, that some things survived being carried a long way if you were careful enough with how you packed them. She thought sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, about the woman who had stepped off the train the autumn before, frightened, certain she understood exactly what kind of danger was coming for her, certain it would arrive wearing the face of a stranger's bed and a marriage she hadn't chosen. That fear had turned out to be aimed at the wrong target entirely. The danger had come, in the end, from an entirely different direction. From a man with an honest smile and a dishonest ledger, and the safety she had been so afraid she'd never find had been standing on the platform the whole time, hat in hand, waiting to walk her somewhere steady. She had been afraid of a wedding night. What she had found instead was a life, built slowly, out of 40 acres and broken locks and careful books and a Marshal who never once asked her to be smaller than she was, only ever asked, patiently, whether there was room for him in what she was building. There had been room. There still was. She had made certain of that herself, with her own hands, long before she let herself believe a man could be trusted to share it.